The afternoon sun cast long, gentle shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead, where the annual summer memorial fete was proceeding with the sort of dignified solemnity that only an English village can properly orchestrate. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath the spreading branches of an ancient oak, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary border in cream-colored wool. To the casual observer, she seemed entirely absorbed in her needlework, but those familiar with Miss Marple's ways would have recognized the telltale signs of her deeper attention. The slight tilt of her head, the occasional pause in her stitching, and the way her mild blue eyes seemed to take in every detail of the scene before her. This year's fete carried particular poignancy, for it served a dual purpose. Beyond the usual charitable endeavors, funds for the church roof has always seemed necessary. The gathering honored the memory of Lady Vivian Ashworth, the beloved former mistress of Ashworth Manor who had perished in a tragic hotel fire in Brighton some 18 months prior. The memorial had been organized by Mrs. Emmeline Wade, the village's most efficient organizer of charitable events, with a sort of military precision that had made her indispensable to every worthy cause in the county. Mrs. Wade herself moved through the crowd with her characteristic brisk efficiency, her dark hair pinned severely beneath a sensible hat, checking arrangements with the dedication of a field marshal reviewing troops. She paused frequently at the memorial display, a collection of Lady Vivian's photographs arranged around a small granite plaque that would later be installed in the churchyard, adjusting flowers and straightening frames with the care of someone for whom every detail mattered profoundly. "Such a tragedy," murmured Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling into the chair beside Miss Marple with a soft rustle of silk. "Vivienne was only 53, you know, in the prime of life, really, and to think she was travelling alone when it happened." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, though her attention had been caught by the small crowd gathering around the Reverend Julian Ponsonby, who was preparing to deliver a brief eulogy. Sir Alistair Ashworth, Lady Vivian's nephew and heir to the manor, stood stiffly beside his wife Caroline, both dressed in appropriate black. Sir Alistair had inherited not only the estate, but also a considerable fortune, a fact that had provided the village gossips with months of speculation about the suddenness of his good fortune. "We gather today," the Reverend began, his voice carrying clearly across the green, "to celebrate the life and mourn the loss of a truly remarkable woman. Lady Vivian Ashworth graced our community with her presence for nearly 15 years, contributing generously to our various causes and touching countless lives with her kindness and wisdom." It was at that moment that Mrs. Price Ridley, positioned strategically near the tea tent where she could monitor all arrivals, released a small, sharp gasp that seemed to pierce the afternoon air like a pin through silk. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she followed Mrs. Price Ridley's horrified gaze toward the lane that led from the village proper to the green. A taxi had appeared, its black form incongruous against the pastoral setting. It drew to a stop near the memorial display with the sort of theatrical timing that would have seemed implausible in a novel, but which life occasionally provides with startling precision. The door opened, and a woman stepped out, carefully, as though testing the firmness of the ground beneath her feet. She was elegantly dressed in a traveling suit of charcoal gray, her silver hair perfectly coiffed beneath a small hat adorned with jet beading. Her face, though marked by lines that spoke of recent hardship, was unmistakably that of Lady Vivian Ashworth. She stood for a moment beside the taxi, her pale blue eyes surveying the gathered crowd with an expression that might have been amusement or calculation, before walking with measured steps toward the memorial display. The effect upon the assembled villagers was immediate and profound. Conversations died mid-sentence. Teacups remained suspended halfway to lips. Children, sensing the sudden tension among the adults, fell silent in their games. Even the Reverend's eulogy faltered and died as he followed the collective gaze of his congregation. "Good afternoon," Lady Vivian said, her voice carrying the same cultured tones that Miss Marple remembered, though there was something new there. A hardness, perhaps, born of whatever experiences had filled the months of her supposed death. "I do hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Sir Alister's face had gone the colour of parchment. Lady Caroline swayed slightly and reached for her husband's arm, though whether from shock or the need for physical support was unclear. Mrs. Wade, who had been arranging chrysanthemums near the memorial photographs, straightened slowly, her efficient hands suddenly still. "Vivian," Mrs. Bantry whispered, her voice barely audible. "But we thought you were dead?" Lady Vivian's smile was neither warm nor cold, but something more unsettling, an expression of someone who had learned uncomfortable truths about the world in her absence. "Yes, I rather gathered that from the memorial service. How thoughtful of you all to organize such a lovely tribute." Miss Marple, observing from her quiet vantage point, noted several things simultaneously. The way Sir Alister's hands had clenched into fists at his sides, the manner in which Mrs. Wade had gone perfectly still except for a slight tremor in her left hand, and the fact that a man in a brown overcoat had emerged from behind a nearby cottage and was watching the proceedings with the patient attention of someone accustomed to surveillance. "But the fire," stammered Mr. Reginald Finch, the village's honorary mayor, his ceremonial chain of office suddenly seeming absurdly inappropriate. "The hotel in Brighton. Your personal effects were found in the ruins." "Personal effects can be arranged," Lady Vivian replied smoothly. "When one has sufficient motivation to disappear, Mr. Finch, it's remarkable what can be accomplished with a little planning and the right sort of assistance." The crowd pressed closer, a mixture of curiosity and unease rippling through the gathered villagers. Miss Marple noticed that Dr. Haydock had quietly positioned himself near Mrs. Wade, his professional instincts apparently alert to signs of distress. Indeed, Mrs. Wade did appear to be struggling with some internal crisis, her usual composure cracking like ice in spring. "I trust," Lady Vivian continued, her gaze moving deliberately from face to face, "that my unexpected survival won't cause too much inconvenience. I understand there may be certain adjustments required to various arrangements made in my absence." It was then that Mrs. Wade made a small, incomprehensible sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a moan, and reached for the memorial table as though seeking support. Her fingers brushed against a small silver sugar bowl that had been placed beside the tea service, and Miss Marple observed with interest that several sugar cubes spilled onto the white tablecloth, their surfaces stained with what appeared to be a faint, crystalline residue. "Emmeline," Dr. Haydock said sharply, moving toward her with professional concern. But Mrs. Wade had already begun to sway, her efficient composure finally abandoning her entirely. She collapsed with surprising grace, folding to the grass beside the memorial display like a marionette whose strings had been suddenly cut. The afternoon, which had begun as a solemn tribute to the dead, had transformed into something far more complex and dangerous. As Dr. Haydock knelt beside Mrs. Wade's still form, checking for signs of life that were no longer there, Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting and rose from her chair. She had seen enough memorial services in her time to recognize when one had become something else entirely. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to St. Mary Mead, and her resurrection had already claimed its first victim. Miss Marple suspected, with the quiet certainty that came from decades of observing human nature at its most revealing, that this was merely the beginning of a far more intricate and deadly puzzle than anyone present could yet imagine. The immediate aftermath of Mrs. Wade's collapse brought forth that peculiar mixture of shock and morbid curiosity that sudden death invariably produces in small communities. Dr. Haydock worked with the quiet efficiency of a man who had attended far too many such scenes over his long career, his weathered hands checking pulse points and examining pupils with methodical thoroughness. When he finally rose from beside the still form, his expression carried the grave certainty that comes with decades of medical practice. "She's gone, I'm afraid," he announced in the hushed tones reserved for such pronouncements. Heart failure, most likely. The shock of seeing Lady Vivian return from the dead, as it were, must have been more than her system could bear. Yet even as he spoke these words, Miss Marple noticed a slight furrow of puzzlement cross his brow, the expression of a medical man encountering something that didn't quite align with his expectations. The crowd's reaction was immediate and varied, revealing the complex social dynamics that govern village life even in moments of crisis. Mrs. Bantry pressed her handkerchief to her lips, murmuring, "Poor dear Emmeline. She was always so strong, so capable. To think that joy, for surely seeing Vivian alive must have been joyful, could prove fatal." Her voice carried the bewildered tone of someone struggling to reconcile sudden death with their understanding of the natural order. The village responds. A collective gasp had given way to whispered speculation as the reality of the situation settled over the memorial fete like an unwelcome shroud. Children, sensing the profound shift in adult behavior, began to cry or cling to their parents with the instinctive understanding that something terrible had occurred. The cheerful bunting and flower arrangements now seemed grotesquely inappropriate, creating an atmosphere of surreal unease that hung over the gathering like morning mist. "It's the shock, plain and simple," declared Mr. Finch, still clutching his ceremonial chain of office, though his air of municipal authority had completely evaporated. To see someone risen from the grave, as it were, poor Emmeline's heart simply couldn't withstand such a profound surprise. Mrs. Price Ridley, having recovered some of her earlier vigor, sniffed dismissively. "Nonsense, Reginald. Emmeline Wade was made of sterner stuff than that. She organized the church bazaar single-handedly for 15 years running. There's more to this than a simple fright, mark my words." Her sharp eyes darted between Lady Vivian and the covered form of Mrs. Wade, as if weighing moral implications that others had yet to consider. A cluster of younger women huddled together near the tea tent, their nervous giggles barely suppressed as one whispered, "Perhaps Lady Vivian really is a ghost, come back for some terrible revenge." Their fanciful theories were quickly hushed by more sensible voices, but the seed of supernatural unease had been planted in fertile ground. Official investigation. Within the hour, the distinctive sound of a police motor car announced the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose perpetually sour expression seemed intensified by this disruption to his Saturday afternoon. He emerged from the vehicle with the methodical efficiency of a man accustomed to dealing with the unexpected, his keen eyes immediately cataloguing the scene before him. The memorial display, the covered body, the cluster of bewildered villagers, and finally, his gaze settling on Lady Vivian Ashworth with unmistakable surprise. "Lady Ashworth," he said, consulting his notebook with deliberate precision, "I was under the distinct impression that you were deceased. Perhaps you could explain this apparent resurrection and its connection to Mrs. Wade's untimely demise." Lady Vivian's response was delivered with the composed grace of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, though perhaps not under such dramatically tragic circumstances. "A misunderstanding, Inspector. I found it necessary to absent myself from society for reasons I prefer not to elaborate upon at present. My return was intended to be quiet and private, but circumstances conspired otherwise." Her pale blue eyes held a mixture of genuine distress and something else. Perhaps calculation, perhaps merely the wariness of someone who had learned to guard her secrets carefully. Miss Marple's quiet observations. Throughout these exchanges, Miss Marple remained in her chair beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles moving with deceptive casualness as her sharp mind catalogued details that others seemed to overlook. She observed the way Sir Alister's hands trembled slightly when he reached for his teacup, the manner in which Lady Caroline's eyes avoided direct contact with her resurrected aunt, and most particularly, the crystalline residue that still sparkled among the scattered sugar cubes beside the memorial table. The man in the brown overcoat had quietly melted away from the scene with the practiced invisibility of someone accustomed to surveillance work, but not before Miss Marple had noted his careful attention to Lady Vivian's every word and gesture. More intriguingly, she had observed a younger man, previously unnoticed at the periphery of the crowd, slip away behind the church hall with the furtive haste of someone eager to avoid official attention. Inspector Slack's preliminary investigation followed the methodical patterns of police procedure, but Miss Marple found herself particularly interested in what he chose not to examine immediately. The sugar bowl, with its telltale spill of cubes showing that faint, unusual residue, remained untouched on the memorial table. Dr. Haydock's diagnosis of heart failure, while certainly plausible, had been delivered with just enough hesitation to suggest professional uncertainty. Deepening mysteries. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the memorial fate transformed into something resembling a crime scene, Miss Marple quietly gathered her knitting and prepared to return home. The feeling that Mrs. Wade's sudden death represented merely the opening movement of a far more complex and dangerous symphony was growing stronger with each passing moment. Lady Vivian's carefully rehearsed explanation of her 18-month absence raised more questions than it answered, particularly regarding the recent developments that had necessitated her return to St. Mary Mead. The village gossips would have much to discuss in the coming days, but Miss Marple suspected that the truth behind both Lady Vivian's resurrection and Mrs. Wade's sudden demise lay buried beneath layers of deception that would require considerable patience and observation to unravel. Human nature, she had learned over many decades, was rarely as straightforward as it appeared on the surface, and the events of this afternoon suggested depths of complexity that would challenge even her considerable understanding of the human heart's capacity for both love and betrayal. The memorial service for a woman who wasn't dead had become a funeral for one who most decidedly was, and Miss Marple felt certain that this ironic reversal was merely the beginning of revelations that would prove far more shocking than a simple case of mistaken identity. The morning after Mrs. Wade's shocking demise brought to St. Mary Mead that peculiar quality of hushed anticipation that follows any dramatic disruption to village routine. The autumn air carried a crisp clarity that seemed designed to wash away confusion, though Miss Marple had learned through decades of observation that daylight rarely simplified the complexities of human nature. She rose early, as was her custom, attending to her small garden and the birds that had come to depend upon her daily ministrations, but found herself drawn toward the village proper by what she would have described as natural curiosity, though others might have recognized it as the methodical beginning of an investigation. The official response. Inspector Slack had established his temporary headquarters in the village hall with the sort of methodical efficiency that characterized his approach to unexpected complications. The memorial site remained cordoned off with police tape, transforming the cheerful green into something resembling a crime scene. The scattered sugar cubes and silver bowl, previously mere refreshment accessories, had now acquired the ominous significance of potential evidence. Dr. Haydock emerged from his consultation with the inspector wearing the troubled expression of a medical man confronting professional uncertainty. When Miss Marple encountered him outside the chemist's shop, his usual gruff confidence had been replaced by something approaching bewilderment. "Miss Marple," he greeted her with courteous warmth, though she detected underlying tension in his manner. "Terrible business yesterday. I must confess, something about Emmeline's collapse doesn't quite sit right with me from a medical perspective." Miss Marple adjusted her grip on her shopping basket and regarded him with the gentle attention that had encouraged countless confidences over the years. "Indeed, Doctor. She always seemed remarkably robust." Dr. Haydock glanced around the street with the caution of a man accustomed to the rapid spread of village gossip before lowering his voice. "Heart failure was my initial assessment, certainly. The symptoms appeared consistent with cardiac arrest brought on by severe shock, but there were certain irregularities that I've requested be examined more thoroughly. The pupils were somewhat dilated, There was a peculiar odor about her person that I couldn't immediately identify. Village undercurrents. By mid-morning, the high street buzzed with animated conversation that followed any dramatic event in a small community. Outside the post office, Mrs. Price Ridley was holding forth to a small but attentive audience, her voice carrying that mixture of horror and excitement that tragic events inevitably produce among those fortunate enough to witness them without being directly affected. "Mark my words," Mrs. Price Ridley declared as Miss Marple approached with her characteristic, unobtrusive manner. "There's something decidedly unnatural about the whole business." And I told Emmeline that the donor list ought to be published. "Transparency," I said. But she was dreadfully huffy about it. "Some people prefer to give anonymously," she said. Anonymous. That's what people say when they don't want their amounts compared. Miss Marple paused to examine a display of early autumn flowers outside the greengrocer's, positioning herself within comfortable listening distance while appearing entirely absorbed in the selection of chrysanthemums. The art of gathering information, she had discovered, lay primarily in remaining invisible, while others revealed their thoughts with surprising candor. An unexpected visit that evening brought Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple's ivy-framed gate, carrying a small basket and wearing an air of bustling purpose that barely concealed her need for companionship in processing the day's extraordinary events. "I have brought a syllabub," she announced as Mary showed her in. It seemed inappropriate at the fete. One can't very well serve syllabub within sight of a corpse. But it won't keep. Miss Marple, who had never in her life refused either a syllabub or a confidant, poured tea and listened while Mrs. Bantry's account of the afternoon's events acquired polish with repetition. "They've taken poor Emmeline to the mortuary, and Inspector Slack's quite set on it being shock. Though why shock should produce such a curious look about the mouth, I don't know. Dr. Haydock didn't care for it. He had that tight look he gets when people tell him what a doctor ought to think." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting. "A curious look? A sort of stiffness. And her hands were so very cold, so very soon." Mrs. Bantry shivered delicately. "Did you see the sugar at the green? It had a glitter to it. The light caught it strangely." "Some sugars do," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Rock sugar particularly, and crystallized sorts. People like pretty things for memorials." Financial complications. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, whose damp hat and weary expression suggested the universe had been designed specifically to keep him working after hours. His consultation with Miss Marple proved brief but illuminating, particularly regarding his growing suspicions about the spilled sugar and Mrs. Wade's sudden terror just before her collapse. After his departure, Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "Vivian said there would need to be adjustments, Jane. If she was thought dead and now isn't, Sir Alistair will have to return everything, won't he? The manor, the money." "It would be complicated," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. "Solicitors do enjoy complications, and Emmeline Wade was remarkably good with complications herself. She could untangle committees that would defeat a lesser woman. Very managing was Emmeline." A mysterious encounter the following morning provided Miss Marple with her most intriguing observation yet. While positioning herself on the church bench with her prayer book, ostensibly for devotional purposes, but actually maintaining a clear view of the Swan Inn, she observed a well-dressed stranger whose London origins were evident in both his bearing and his obvious unfamiliarity with village customs. His 20-minute conversation with Lady Vivian in the inn's small garden was conducted too distantly for Miss Marple to overhear, but their body language spoke eloquently about urgency and tension. Lady Vivian's rigid composure wavered notably when the stranger gestured toward a manila envelope, and after his departure, she remained in the garden staring at its contents with an expression that might have been calculation, or perhaps desperation. Quiet observations. On her way home, Miss Marple encountered the man in the brown overcoat from the previous day's fete. He stepped aside politely, touching his hat with practiced courtesy. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, as if they were old acquaintances. "Marcus Bell. I'm staying at the Swan. I wonder if, at your convenience, I might ask you a few questions about Lady Vivian." "Of course," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "People are always asking questions about those who return from the dead. It's only natural." As she continued homeward, Miss Marple reflected that in St. Mary Mead, it was not the dead who caused inconvenience, but the living. And if one listened carefully enough, they nearly always revealed what one needed to know. The memorial service for a woman who wasn't dead had become the catalyst for something far more sinister than anyone yet realized, and she suspected that Mrs. Wade's death was merely the opening movement of a considerably more complex and dangerous symphony. The village had begun to settle into its new reality. Lady Vivian alive, Mrs. Wade dead, and secrets stirring beneath the surface like leaves before a storm. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to watch, listen, and wait for the next revelation that would inevitably come. The morning after Mrs. Wade's shocking demise brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage with news that transformed the entire complexion of the case. His usually stern expression carried an additional weight of professional concern as he settled his damp hat beside her morning tea service, clearly wrestling with revelations that had shattered his initial assumptions about a simple death from shock. The poisoning revealed. "Miss Marple," he began without his customary pleasantries, "Dr. Haydock's post-mortem examination has uncovered something most disturbing. Mrs. Wade's death was not natural. She was poisoned. We found significant traces of digitalis in her system, far exceeding any therapeutic dose. The sugar cubes scattered near the memorial table tested positive for the same substance." Miss Marple set aside her knitting with the careful attention she reserved for matters of genuine gravity. The revelation, while shocking to others, seemed to settle into place within her understanding like the final piece of a partially completed puzzle. "Digitalis," she murmured thoughtfully. "From foxgloves, I believe. How very clever, and how very cruel." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. The poison was concentrated in those particular sugar cubes. Someone knew Mrs. Wade's habits well enough to predict she would reach for them during a moment of stress. What's more curious is that silver sugar bowl itself. Dr. Haydock noticed it bore an engraved monogram, an ornate A, interlaced in the old-fashioned style. "An Ashworth piece," Miss Marple observed mildly, though her sharp mind was already cataloguing the implications. How thoughtful of someone to provide such elegant service for the memorial, and how telling that they chose that particular vessel for such a deadly purpose. The village focuses on Sir Alistair. By afternoon, the revelation of murder had transformed the village's gossip from mere speculation into something approaching a witch hunt. The obvious suspect emerged with a sort of dramatic clarity that satisfied both the community's need for resolution and Inspector Slack's preference for straightforward motives. Sir Alistair Ashworth, the nephew who stood to lose everything upon his aunt's resurrection, found himself at the center of increasingly hostile attention. Mrs. Price Ridley, holding court outside the post office with her usual authority, declared to her assembled audience, "Mark my words, it's always about money in the end. Sir Alistair inherited everything when Vivian was thought dead. The manor, the investments, the entire estate. Now she returns, and suddenly poor Emmeline is poisoned at a memorial service using Ashworth family silver. The symbolism alone is damning." The theory gained momentum throughout the village with a sort of inexorable logic that made complex situations appear deceptively simple. Inspector Slack's questioning of Sir Alistair at the manor had been conducted with official thoroughness in the young baronet's nervous demeanor. His shaking hands, mismatched cufflinks, and obvious distress only served to reinforce suspicions about his guilt. Miss Marple's contrary observations. Yet Miss Marple found herself profoundly troubled by the very neatness of this solution. during her afternoon visit to arrange flowers at the church, a task that conveniently positioned her to observe the comings and goings throughout the village. She reflected upon several details that seemed inconsistent with Sir Alistair as the perpetrator. The difficulty, she confided to Inspector Slack during his evening visit, lies in Mrs. Wade's relationship with sugar. You see, Inspector, Emmeline was quite proud of having given up sugar in her tea. "The waste at our age, Miss Marple," she told me just last Lent. She was most particular about it. A point of vanity, really. Inspector Slack frowned. Then why was she at the sugar bowl at all? Precisely the question, Miss Marple agreed gently. If one doesn't take sugar oneself, why would one reach for it unless one was doing something for someone else? Or perhaps, she added with the sort of mild speculation that often concealed her sharpest insights, unless one was startled into reaching for the wrong thing entirely. New witnesses and revelations. The investigation took on additional complexity with the arrival of Timothy Wade, Mrs. Wade's nephew, whose grief-stricken account provided disturbing new dimensions to his aunt's final days. The young man, perhaps 25, and bearing the nervous energy of someone perpetually on the verge of flight, had come to St. Mary Mead to surprise his aunt at the memorial service, only to arrive as the ambulance was departing. She telephoned me 3 days ago. Timothy confided to Miss Marple with the desperate need for sympathy that the bereaved often display. Aunt Emmeline was frightened, genuinely terrified, which was so unlike her. She said she had discovered irregularities in the charitable accounts, discrepancies that would shock the entire village and bring down pillars of the community. She intended to confront the responsible party at the memorial service. This revelation cast Mrs. Wade's death in an entirely different light, suggesting that she had been killed not as collateral damage in a plot against Lady Vivian, but as the primary target, silenced before she could expose financial crimes that someone was desperate to conceal. Marcus Bell, the mysterious man in the brown overcoat, provided additional layers of complexity when he called upon Miss Marple that evening. His explanation of Lady Vivian's 18-month absence revealed a web of financial manipulation and personal vendettas that had necessitated her dramatic departure from society. The hotel fire in Brighton was genuine, he explained with the studied precision of someone accustomed to dealing in dangerous truths. But Lady Vivian's supposed death was carefully orchestrated to protect her from individuals whose criminal activities she had inadvertently discovered. Mrs. Wade's investigation into the charitable funds may have uncovered the same information that originally forced Lady Vivienne into hiding. Suspicious developments. Miss Marple's observational skills, honed by decades of village life, detected several troubling details that others had overlooked. During her encounter with Lady Caroline Ashworth near the manor gates, she noticed that the woman's recently polished gloves bore a greenish stain near the thumb of the right hand, the sort of discoloration that might result from handling old copper or certain chemical compounds. More significantly, Inspector Slack's search of the manor had revealed that the key to the muniment room was missing. Sir Alistair had dismissed this as a household oversight, but the room contained old papers, deeds and documents that might well hold secrets worth killing to protect. Nothing of immediate value, Sir Alistair had assured the inspector, though Lady Caroline's barely perceptible flinch at these words suggested that her definition of value might differ considerably from her husband's. The case grows complex. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected upon the growing complexity of the case. The obvious suspect, Sir Alistair, seemed increasingly unlikely to be the perpetrator, despite his clear financial motive and nervous behavior. The digitalis poisoning had required careful planning, intimate knowledge of Mrs. Wade's habits, and access to both the poison and the Ashworth family silver. More importantly, it suggested someone who knew that Mrs. Wade's investigation was approaching dangerous revelations. The memorial service intended to honor the dead had instead created the perfect circumstances for murder, with the poisoned sugar cubes waiting in the elegant silver bowl like a trap set for an unsuspecting victim. Mrs. Wade had died not from shock at Lady Vivian's resurrection, but because she had gotten too close to secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to expose financial crimes and personal betrayals, but it was the living who had proven most dangerous. As Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, she prepared to unravel the threads of deception that connected charitable funds, missing documents, and a murder weapon disguised as simple hospitality. The truth, she suspected, would prove far more shocking than anyone yet imagined, and would reveal that evil often wore the most respectable of faces. Miss Marple had learned through decades of village life that the most revealing truths often emerged not from dramatic confrontations, but from the quiet accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details. The morning after Inspector Slack's revelation about the digitalis poisoning, she found herself drawn to what others might dismiss as trivialities. The precise manner in which Mrs. Wade had reached for the sugar, the particular voice that had offered comfort, and most intriguingly, a tiny fragment of plant matter that clung to the memorial tablecloth like a whispered confession. The financial web unraveled. Timothy Wade's arrival at her cottage gate brought with it a leather satchel containing documents that transformed the entire complexion of the case. The young man's grief had crystallized into a burning determination for justice, and his aunt's meticulous record-keeping had preserved evidence of systematic financial manipulation that extended far beyond simple charitable theft. She discovered a pattern, Timothy explained, spreading the carefully annotated papers across Miss Marple's sitting-room table. Small amounts consistently skimmed from various collections over the past 18 months, never enough to be immediately noticeable, but accumulating to nearly £300. More importantly, she had identified the perpetrator and planned a private confrontation before making any public accusations. Miss Marple examined the documents with the methodical attention she might devote to a complex knitting pattern. The thefts had begun precisely when Lady Vivian was presumed dead, suggesting someone who had taken advantage of the disruption to village routines. Yet the pattern revealed something more personal than mere opportunism. This was betrayal by someone Mrs. Wade had trusted completely. A botanical signature. During her afternoon walk past the cordoned memorial site, Miss Marple's sharp eyes detected what the official investigation had overlooked. Caught on a thread of the white tablecloth was a microscopic fragment, dark, fibrous, with the distinctive texture of dried plant matter. To most observers, it would appear as ordinary debris from an outdoor event, but Miss Marple recognized it as something far more significant. The fragment, combined with Dr. Haydick's mention of a peculiar odor about Mrs. Wade's person, suggested that the digitalis had been freshly prepared from foxglove plants rather than obtained in pharmaceutical form. This indicated someone with both botanical knowledge and access to a substantial supply of the poisonous flowers. Knowledge that extended beyond simple gardening into the more specialized realm of herbal preparation. Voices and hands. The Reverend Ponsonby's troubled recollection provided another crucial piece to the emerging puzzle. During their encounter at the Lich Gate, his memory had crystallized around a specific detail that had initially seemed insignificant. Someone spoke to Mrs. Wade just before she reached for the sugar. He confided to Miss Marple, a woman's voice saying, "Here, dear, this will steady you." It was the sort of maternal comfort one offers instinctively to someone in distress, but I cannot place the speaker. This testimony gained additional significance when combined with young Mrs. Ponsonby's observation at the vicarage. Lydia had noticed a very pretty hand placing something into Mrs. Wade's grasp. Pale, elegant, adorned with a small signet ring, old-fashioned rather than a wedding band. The gesture had seemed genuinely caring, which made its deadly purpose all the more chilling. The sugar bowl's true origin. Miss Marple's investigation into the memorial arrangements revealed a crucial detail that had been obscured by the chaos following Mrs. Wade's collapse. The elegant silver sugar bowl, initially assumed to be Ashworth family silver due to its quality and the circumstances, had actually been contributed by Lady Caroline Ashworth as part of a selection of pieces to show goodwill in difficult times. Mrs. Greaves, the manor housekeeper, confirmed that Lady Caroline had personally selected and prepared the items, wrapping them carefully before sending them to the church with young Elsie. The choice of that particular bowl, with its ornate design and substantial capacity, had seemed thoughtfully appropriate for such a solemn occasion. A pattern of calculated cruelty. Dr. Haydock's more detailed examination of the evidence revealed the true sophistication of the murder method. The digitalis had been applied with surgical precision to specific sugar cubes that bore tiny, almost invisible scratches. Marks that would be meaningless to anyone except the person who had made them. This wasn't random poisoning, but targeted assassination disguised as an act of kindness. The killer had exploited Mrs. Wade's well-known pride in having eliminated sugar from her diet, knowing that she would never normally reach for sugar cubes herself. Only in a moment of extreme distress, when offered comfort by a trusted voice, would she accept what seemed like motherly care, but was actually a precisely calculated death sentence. Lady Caroline's suspicious behavior. Miss Marple's observations of Lady Caroline Ashworth had accumulated into a troubling pattern of behavior. The greenish stains on her expensive gloves, initially explained as brass tarnish from old hinges, took on new significance when considered alongside her access to both the memorial arrangements and the manor's extensive gardens. The Ashworth estate was renowned for its formal gardens, which included a substantial herb garden where foxgloves grew in carefully, tended profusion. More tellingly, Lady Caroline's nervous energy since Lady Vivian's return had manifested in obsessive attention to the muniment room, the repository of old papers and documents that might contain evidence of financial irregularities. Her claim that she was merely organizing papers for the solicitors seemed less convincing when viewed alongside Timothy Wade's revelations about his aunt's investigation. The emerging truth. Miss Marple began to perceive the true scope of the conspiracy that had necessitated Mrs. Wade's death. The systematic theft from charitable funds had required someone with intimate knowledge of village financial procedures, access to collection boxes and account records, and the trust of the community. Lady Caroline, as the wife of the local magistrate and a prominent figure in charitable organizations, possessed all these advantages. Mrs. Wade's investigation had threatened to expose not merely theft, but a complex web of financial manipulation that had taken advantage of Lady Vivian's supposed death to redirect funds and obscure their true destinations. The memorial service had provided the perfect opportunity to eliminate this threat while simultaneously dealing with Lady Vivian's inconvenient resurrection. The poisoned sugar cubes had been prepared with the cold calculation of someone who understood Mrs. Wade's habits intimately. Her pride in avoiding sugar, her instinctive response to maternal comfort in moments of distress, and her position as the one person whose financial expertise posed a genuine threat to the conspiracy. Miss Marple's growing certainty. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected upon the careful orchestration that had transformed a memorial service into a murder scene. The killer had exploited the most fundamental human instincts, the offer of comfort to someone in distress, the acceptance of kindness from a trusted source, and weaponized them with deadly precision. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned with dangerous knowledge, but it was the living who had proven most dangerous. Mrs. Wade's murder had been disguised as a tragic coincidence, her death from shock at Lady Vivian's resurrection, but the reality was far more sinister, a calculated assassination designed to protect secrets that someone was willing to kill to preserve. The botanical evidence, the financial records, the carefully prepared murder weapon, and the testimonies of unwitting witnesses all pointed toward a killer who had hidden behind respectability while systematically betraying the trust of an entire community. Miss Marple prepared to watch and wait for the final pieces of evidence that would allow her to expose the truth with the gentle but inexorable certainty that had made her reputation as St. Mary Mead's most perceptive observer of human nature. The memorial for the dead had become a funeral for the living, and the true tragedy lay not in Lady Vivian's supposed death, but in the very real corruption that had poisoned the heart of village life itself. The morning after the Digitalis revelation brought to St. Mary Mead that peculiar quality of suppressed excitement that follows any confirmation of village suspicions. The autumn air carried more than the scent of burning leaves. It seemed charged with the electricity of secrets about to be exposed. Miss Marple observed from her cottage window as the daily routines of village life continued with studied normalcy, though she noted the way conversation ceased when certain individuals approached, and how eyes followed Lady Caroline Ashworth with the persistent attention usually reserved for creatures in a menagerie. The will that changed everything. Marcus Bell's return to Miss Marple's sitting room that afternoon carried with it revelations that transformed the entire landscape of motive and opportunity. His leather portfolio contained photocopied documents that had been painstakingly reconstructed from fragments found in Lady Vivian's Brighton solicitor's files, papers that Mrs. Wade had been desperately seeking in her final investigation. The crucial document, Bell explained with the precision of someone accustomed to dealing in dangerous truths, was a new will that Lady Vivian had executed just 3 weeks before her supposed death. Unlike her previous testament, which left the bulk of her estate to Sir Alistair, this document designated the majority of her fortune to charitable foundations, with Mrs. Wade named as primary trustee and administrator. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed the full implications. The memorial service had not been merely about honoring the dead, but about protecting secrets that could destroy the living. And Lady Caroline would have known about these arrangements. Indeed, Lady Vivian had specifically consulted her about which local charities should benefit, seeking her advice about organizations that would use substantial endowments most effectively. Lady Caroline's recommendations were incorporated into the final document, giving her intimate knowledge of provisions that would have rendered her husband's inheritance virtually worthless. Botanical evidence confirmed. Dr. Haydock's detailed analysis of the plant fragment discovered at the memorial site provided the scientific foundation for what Miss Marple's observational skills had already suggested. The specimen matched foxgloves from the Ashworth estate's herb garden. Specifically, a rare white cultivar that Lady Caroline had imported from a specialist botanical society in Devon as part of her scholarly interest in medicinal plants. The preparation required considerable expertise, Dr. Haydock explained during his afternoon visit, his weathered hands gesturing with professional precision. Someone with advanced knowledge of extraction, techniques, concentration methods, and dosage calculations. Lady Caroline's botanical studies at Girton included a thesis on traditional medicinal applications of poisonous plants. She possessed both the theoretical knowledge and practical skills necessary to prepare such a concentrated digitalis solution. More significantly, the estate's head gardener had confirmed that Lady Caroline had visited the herb garden on the morning of the memorial service, ostensibly to gather flowers for the arrangements. Her particular attention to the foxglove bed and her specific request that the area remain undisturbed while she worked now acquired sinister significance in light of subsequent events. Financial desperation. Revealed. Timothy Wade's continued investigation into his aunt's meticulous records revealed the true scope of Lady Caroline's criminal activities and the desperate circumstances that had driven her to murder. The systematic theft from charitable funds represented not mere opportunism, but a calculated attempt to prevent financial ruin that would have destroyed both her marriage and her carefully constructed social position. She had been speculating heavily on the London Stock Exchange, Timothy explained, his voice tight with controlled anger as he spread the damning evidence across Miss Marple's tea table. When her investments failed catastrophically, she began borrowing against expected inheritances, using charitable funds as collateral for increasingly desperate private loans. Lady Vivian's new will threatened to eliminate those inheritances entirely, leaving Lady Caroline facing both exposure and bankruptcy. The memorial service had provided what seemed like the perfect solution to multiple problems. The poisoned sugar cubes had been prepared specifically for Lady Vivian, whose return threatened to expose not only the missing will, but also the systematic embezzlement that had funded Lady Caroline's gambling addiction. Mrs. Wade's death, while unintended, had served as an acceptable alternative when circumstances shifted unexpectedly. The signet ring evidence. Miss Marple's attention to seemingly insignificant details proved crucial when young Mrs. Ponsonby provided additional clarity about the pretty hand she'd observed, offering comfort to Mrs. Wade. The signet ring bore not a simple monogram, but an elaborate intertwining of letters in the old-fashioned style that suggested both family heritage and personal vanity. Lady Caroline's explanation that the ring had belonged to her grandmother seemed plausible, until Miss Marple's discreet inquiries revealed a more troubling truth. The piece had actually been purchased from an antique dealer in Brighton just 3 months prior, timing that coincided precisely with her increasing desperation about financial exposure and her growing awareness that Mrs. Wade's investigation was approaching dangerous revelations. The sugar bowls. Provenance. Marcus Bell's consultation with Lady Vivian provided the final piece of physical evidence that connected Lady Caroline directly to the murder weapon. The elegant silver sugar bowl, initially assumed to be generic Ashworth family silver, had actually been a specific wedding gift that Lady Vivian had commissioned specially for her nephew's bride. The design was unique, Bell confirmed, consulting his notes with professional thoroughness. Lady Vivian remembered it distinctly because she had worked with the silversmith to incorporate both family crests in the decorative border. Lady Caroline's use of this particular piece was either remarkably careless or deliberately symbolic, a final insult to the family that had welcomed her into their circle. Psychological observations. Miss Marple's decades of observing human nature allowed her to perceive the psychological progression that had transformed Lady Caroline from a respectable society matron into a calculating murderer. The gambling addiction had begun as sophisticated entertainment, a way to demonstrate financial acumen and social connections among her London acquaintances. When losses mounted beyond concealment, desperation had driven increasingly reckless measures. The theft from charitable funds had seemed like a temporary solution, money that could be borrowed and repaid once her investments recovered. Mrs. Wade's investigation threatened to expose not only the financial crimes, but also the elaborate web of lies and deceptions that Lady Caroline had constructed to maintain her facade of respectability. Growing suspicion and nervous behavior. Lady Caroline's behavior in the days following Mrs. Wade's death provided additional confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions. Her usual composed efficiency had given way to brittle nervousness that manifested in obsessive attention to details that had never previously concerned her. Mrs. Greaves, the manor housekeeper, confided that Lady Caroline had spent entire nights in the muniment room, claiming to organize papers for the solicitors, but actually destroying evidence that might connect her to the financial irregularities. She's been quite particular about the herb garden as well, Mrs. Greaves added with the loyalty of long service, warring against growing unease. Insisted on replanting the entire foxglove bed herself, though we've never known her to do manual garden work before. Said she wanted everything properly arranged before Lady Vivian resumed residence. The memorial service trap. The true sophistication of Lady Caroline's plan became apparent as Miss Marple reconstructed the events of that tragic afternoon. The poisoned sugar cubes had been prepared with surgical precision, marked with tiny scratches that would identify them to their creator, while remaining invisible to potential victims. The choice of digitalis had been calculated to mimic heart failure, a plausible cause of death for someone experiencing the shock of seeing a supposedly dead person return to life. The use of the commemorative silver bowl had been designed to implicate Sir Alistair in any subsequent investigation, providing Lady Caroline with both revenge against her husband's family and protection for herself. The botanical signature of the rare white foxgloves would point toward the manor's gardens, but not necessarily toward her specifically, as several people had access to the carefully tended herb collection. Building toward resolution. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected upon the careful orchestration that had transformed charitable work into criminal enterprise and family loyalty into murderous betrayal. Lady Caroline had exploited every advantage of her social position, her botanical knowledge, her access to charitable funds, her intimate understanding of village routines, to construct a web of deception that had ultimately required murder to maintain. The memorial service for a woman who wasn't dead had become a funeral for someone who most decidedly was, and the tragic irony lay in the fact that both deaths, the supposed one and the actual one, had been orchestrated by the same calculating intelligence. Mrs. Wade had died because she had gotten too close to truths about financial corruption that extended far beyond simple theft into systematic betrayal of community trust. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared for the delicate confrontation that would expose Lady Caroline's crimes. The gentle facade of village respectability often concealed depths of corruption that would shock even those accustomed to human weakness, and justice would require careful maneuvering to ensure that the guilty faced appropriate consequences for their calculated cruelty. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to reveal secrets that someone was willing to kill to protect, but it was the living who had proven most dangerous. In the quiet drawing rooms and polite gatherings of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple would soon orchestrate the final act of a drama where maternal comfort had delivered death and charitable virtue had masked a heart capable of the coldest calculation. The night brought to Ashworth Manor the sort of theatrical drama that seemed designed to test the nerves of all concerned. Miss Marple was awakened shortly after 11 by the urgent pealing of bells that carried across the village with unmistakable urgency. By the time she had dressed and made her way to the manor, smoke was already dissipating from the east wing, and the household was in that state of controlled chaos that follows any emergency involving fire and ancient timber. The muniment room, monsieur. Inspector Slack's examination of the scene revealed what Miss Marple had already suspected from the peculiar pattern of destruction. This had been no accidental blaze. The muniment room, repository of the Ashworth family's most important documents, bore the unmistakable signs of deliberate arson. The fire had been started near the writing desk with what Dr. Haydock's nose identified as paraffin, and had been carefully directed toward the iron-bound chest containing testamentary papers. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for, Inspector Slack observed grimly, surveying the blackened remains of what had once been meticulously organized family records. The fire was set to destroy specific documents while making the destruction appear accidental. Fortunately for us, they were interrupted before completing their work. Lady Caroline's explanation for the missing key, that it had simply vanished from its usual hook in the morning room, seemed increasingly implausible when viewed alongside her obvious distress at the fire's incomplete success. Her composure, usually so perfectly maintained, had acquired a brittle quality that suggested someone fighting to maintain control over rapidly deteriorating circumstances. Crucial evidence survives. Miss Marple's careful examination of the scene yielded what proved to be the most damaging evidence yet discovered. A single sheet of paper had fluttered into the corner by the skirting board and survived with only a singed edge. The handwriting at the top was unmistakably Mrs. Wade's precise script, and beneath it lay a list of names with corresponding amounts, followed by a note in her characteristic hand. Ask si rare advances, digitalis garden. More significantly, Marcus Bell's consultation with Lady Vivian revealed the existence of correspondence that cast Lady Caroline's financial difficulties in an even more sinister light. Among the papers Lady Vivian had retrieved from her Brighton solicitor was a series of increasingly urgent letters, signed only with the initial C, demanding immediate payment of substantial sums and threatening consequences for continued delays. The language was always polite, Lady Vivian explained to Miss Marple during their private consultation, but the underlying menace was unmistakable. Someone had been systematically embezzling charitable funds and using my supposed death as cover for increasingly desperate financial manipulations. A dangerous invitation. The following afternoon brought an invitation that Miss Marple recognized as both an opportunity and a potential trap. Lady Caroline had organized what she described as a small luncheon at the Manor to discuss the continuation of the Memorial Fund's charitable work. But Miss Marple detected a more calculated purpose behind the seemingly innocent gathering. Timothy Wade's presence at the luncheon felt deliberately provocative, particularly given his continued investigation into his aunt's financial records. Lady Caroline's behavior throughout the meal displayed a nervous energy that manifested in excessive attention to her guests' comfort. Personally preparing tea, arranging flowers with obsessive precision, and maintaining a stream of conversation that seemed designed to prevent uncomfortable silences. The sugar bowl returns. Miss Marple's sharp eyes immediately recognized the silver sugar bowl that Lady Caroline used to serve refreshments, the same ornate piece that had delivered death at the memorial service. Its reappearance seemed both brazen and calculated, as if Lady Caroline were testing whether anyone would make the connection or challenge her use of what had become evidence in a murder investigation. When Lady Caroline personally prepared Timothy's coffee, adding cream and sugar cubes with elaborate care, Miss Marple observed the telltale scratch marks on one of the cubes. Microscopic scratches that matched Dr. Haydick's description of the markings found on the poisoned sugar at the memorial service. The realization that she was witnessing another attempted murder filled Miss Marple with cold certainty. Lady Caroline's desperation had driven her to attempt eliminating Timothy Wade using the same method that had killed his aunt, displaying a ruthless consistency that spoke of a mind capable of the coldest calculation. Quiet intervention. The intervention came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the sort of gentle misdirection that Miss Marple had perfected over decades of village life. A carefully timed comment about the coffee growing cold, combined with Lady Vivian's strategically placed cough that caused a minor distraction, allowed Miss Marple to suggest switching cups with Timothy, ostensibly to accommodate her failing eyesight, but actually to prevent another poisoning. Lady Caroline's reaction to this seemingly innocent exchange was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, her hands trembled as she reached for the sugar tongs, and her eyes darted between Timothy and Miss Marple with the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully laid trap had been quietly dismantled. The net closes. Inspector Slack's arrival with confirmation of the London Bank's findings provided the final pieces of evidence needed to complete the case against Lady Caroline. The irregular transactions, the missing charitable funds, and the systematic embezzlement that had begun immediately after Lady Vivian's supposed death created an unbreakable chain of financial motive connecting Lady Caroline to both murders. The attempted poisoning of Timothy Wade, rather than eliminating a threat, had instead provided the final proof of Lady Caroline's guilt. Her use of the same method, the same marked sugar cubes, and even the same silver bowl demonstrated a pattern of behavior that spoke of calculated malice disguised as charitable hospitality. Miss Marple's growing certainty. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected upon the careful orchestration that had transformed charitable work into criminal enterprise. Lady Caroline had exploited every advantage of her social position, her botanical knowledge, her access to charitable funds, her intimate understanding of village routines, to construct a web of deception that had ultimately required multiple murders to maintain. The memorial service for a woman who wasn't dead had become the catalyst for revealing corruption that extended far beyond simple theft into systematic betrayal of community trust. Mrs. Wade had died because she had discovered financial irregularities that threatened to expose Lady Caroline's crimes, and Timothy Wade had nearly suffered the same fate for continuing his aunt's investigation. The fire at the muniment room represented Lady Caroline's desperate attempt to destroy evidence of her systematic embezzlement, while the attempted poisoning of Timothy demonstrated her willingness to commit additional murders to protect her secrets. The gentle facade of village respectability had concealed a heart capable of the coldest calculation, and Miss Marple prepared for the final confrontation that would expose the truth with the inexorable certainty that characterized justice in St. Mary Mead. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to reveal secrets that someone was willing to kill repeatedly to protect, but it was the living who had proven most dangerous. In the quiet drawing rooms and charitable gatherings of village life, maternal comfort had delivered death, and the most respectable appearances had masked the darkest intentions. The morning after the attempted poisoning of Timothy Wade brought to St. Mary Mead an atmosphere of grim satisfaction that Miss Marple recognized as dangerously premature. The village had settled into the comfortable narrative that Lady Caroline Ashworth would soon face justice for her systematic crimes, and Inspector Slack's methodical gathering of evidence suggested that the case was approaching its inevitable conclusion. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her cottage window as the daily routines resumed with studied normalcy, felt the peculiar unease that came when human nature prepared to reveal one final, devastating surprise: the shocking discovery. The tranquility was shattered just after dusk by Mrs. Greaves's frantic telephone call to Dr. Haydock. Sir Alister had not appeared for dinner, and when she went to summon him, she discovered the garage doors of the coach-house firmly closed, despite the Rolls-Royce being absent from its usual position in the drive. The sickly, sweet smell of exhaust fumes seeping beneath the doors told its own terrible story before anyone had the courage to force the entrance. Inspector Slack arrived to find Sir Alister slumped over the steering wheel of the family motor car, the engine still ticking faintly in the enclosed space. The scene bore all the hallmarks of deliberate self-destruction: the carefully sealed garage, the methodical positioning of the vehicle, and most significantly, a folded sheet of notepaper tucked between the speedometer and steering wheel. The confession, written in Sir Alister's familiar hand, was brief but comprehensive. "I cannot endure the consequences of my weakness. I poisoned Mrs. Wade, I set the fire in the muniment room, and I would have done worse. The shame of what I have done to preserve my inheritance has made me unfit to carry the Ashworth name. Forgive me, those who can." Official acceptance. Inspector Slack's reaction was immediate and decisive. The confession provided a neat resolution to all the outstanding questions: the financial motive, the botanical knowledge, the access to both poison and opportunity. Sir Alister's nervous behavior since Lady Vivian's return, his obvious distress at the memorial service, and his clear desperation about losing his inheritance all supported the narrative of a weak man driven to murder by financial pressure. "It explains everything," Inspector Slack declared to Dr. Haydock as they supervised the removal of the body. The nephew stood to lose everything when his aunt returned from the dead. He panicked, killed Mrs. Wade when she got too close to the truth about the missing charitable funds, and when he realized we were closing in, he took the coward's way out. The village's response was swift and decisive. Mrs. Price Ridley, speaking with the authority of someone who had always suspected weakness in the Ashworth line, pronounced Sir Alister's guilt with satisfaction. A tragedy, certainly, but not unexpected. He always had a weak chin, too much indulgence as a boy. Money spoiled him, and when the pressure came, he simply couldn't bear it. Miss Marple's quiet observations. Yet Miss Marple, examining the confession during Inspector Slack's briefing at the village hall, detected several details that troubled her experienced eye. Sir Alister's handwriting, while superficially correct, displayed subtle inconsistencies that suggested someone copying rather than composing naturally. The phrase, "those who can," struck her as particularly odd. Sir Alister's usual correspondence employed the more modest, "those who will," a distinction that spoke of different educational backgrounds and social assumptions. More significantly, Dr. Haydock's examination of the body revealed physical details that didn't align perfectly with carbon monoxide poisoning. The peculiar paleness of the fingertips, the looseness of the collar as though adjusted by unfamiliar hands, and the perfect matching of Sir Alister's cufflinks suggested someone who had been dressed with care rather than the disheveled appearance of a man in the throes of suicidal despair. The ink evidence. Miss Marple's request to examine the confession more closely yielded the most damning evidence yet. The ink, while appearing to match Sir Alister's usual fountain pen, bore a faint, blue-green tinge that she remembered from Lady Caroline's elegant writing instrument. A fashionable fountain pen whose distinctive ink had left telltale stains on her gloves during their recent luncheon at the Manor. Marcus Bell's arrival with additional evidence confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. A small square of blotting paper found in Lady Caroline's writing desk bore the same distinctive ink signature, and more tellingly, showed the reversed impression of several practice attempts at Sir Alister's signature. The confession had been carefully prepared, with Lady Caroline practicing the forgery until she could reproduce her husband's handwriting with sufficient accuracy to fool a cursory examination. Lady Caroline's calculated response. Lady Caroline's reaction to her husband's supposed suicide was masterfully performed. The appropriate grief of a devoted wife, the shocked disbelief that her beloved Alister could have been capable of such terrible crimes. Yet Miss Marple observed the subtle signs of relief beneath the carefully orchestrated sorrow. The way Lady Caroline's hands had steadied for the first time in days, her renewed attention to personal grooming, and, most tellingly, her immediate practical concerns about funeral arrangements and estate matters. Poor Alister, Lady Caroline murmured to the assembled mourners, her voice carrying precisely the right note of tragic bewilderment. I never suspected the terrible burden he was carrying. If only he had confided in me, perhaps this tragedy could have been prevented. The true scope of the deception, Miss Marple's investigation into the circumstances of Sir Alister's death, revealed the full sophistication of Lady Caroline's final gambit. The garage had been sealed from the outside using putty and cloth strips that bore microscopic fibers matching Lady Caroline's gardening gloves. The timing of the death, calculated to occur during Lady Caroline's well-documented visit to the vicarage for charitable planning, provided her with an unshakable alibi while ensuring the body would be discovered at precisely the right moment. Most chillingly, Dr. Haydock's more detailed examination suggested that Sir Alister had been rendered unconscious before being positioned in the motor car, probably through the same digitalis that had killed Mrs. Wade, administered in a concentrated dose that would mimic heart failure before the carbon monoxide could complete its deadly work. Lady Caroline had murdered her own husband to provide a convenient scapegoat for her crimes, displaying a ruthless calculation that shocked even Miss Marple's experienced understanding of human evil. The village deceived. The confession's acceptance by both official authorities and village opinion demonstrated Lady Caroline's sophisticated understanding of human psychology. People wanted a resolution that made sense of the terrible events, and Sir Alister's suicide provided exactly the sort of tragic but comprehensible ending that satisfied their need for closure. the weak nephew, corrupted by money and driven to murder by desperation, fit perfectly into familiar narratives about hereditary weakness and moral failure. Yet Miss Marple recognized that this apparent resolution was actually Lady Caroline's most dangerous deception yet. By sacrificing her husband, she had eliminated the one person who might have eventually discovered her crimes while simultaneously providing herself with the perfect cover for her systematic theft and murder. The grieving widow, shocked by her husband's terrible secret, would be above suspicion while she consolidated her control over the remaining estate assets. Building toward the final confrontation. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected upon the careful orchestration that had transformed a memorial service into a series of calculated murders. Lady Caroline had exploited every advantage of her social position. Her botanical knowledge, her access to charitable funds, her intimate understanding of village routines, and finally, her marriage to a trusting and vulnerable man, to construct a web of deception that had ultimately required multiple murders to maintain. The confession that seemed to resolve all questions had actually raised new and more disturbing ones. Miss Marple prepared for the delicate task of exposing a killer who had proven willing to murder her own husband to protect her secrets. The final confrontation would require all her skill and experience, for Lady Caroline had demonstrated a capacity for ruthless calculation that made her far more dangerous than anyone yet realized. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to expose financial corruption, but it was the living who had proven most deadly. In the quiet drawing rooms of St. Mary Mead, respectability had masked the coldest calculation, and the most sacred bonds of marriage and community trust had been weaponized in service of greed and self-preservation. The memorial for the dead had become a funeral for multiple victims, and Miss Marple knew that only the most careful maneuvering would prevent Lady Caroline from claiming additional lives in her desperate flight from justice. The apparent resolution was actually the beginning of the most dangerous phase of the case, and Miss Marple prepared to orchestrate the final revelation with the patient precision that had made her St. Mary Mead's most formidable observer of human nature at its most revealing and most deadly. The morning after Sir Alister's apparent suicide brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage gate, young Elsie from Ashworth Manor, clutching a wrapped bundle with the nervous energy of someone carrying dangerous secrets. Her testimony would prove to be the final piece needed to construct Lady Caroline's psychological trap, though Miss Marple had already begun to perceive the elegant solution that would expose the truth without dramatic confrontation or accusation. The parlour maid's crucial evidence. Elsie's revelation about the early morning hours preceding Sir Alister's supposed suicide provided the missing link that connected Lady Caroline directly to her husband's murder. The young woman's account of watching Lady Caroline dress her unconscious husband like a doll, combined with the physical evidence of the greenish digitalis residue on his clothing, confirmed what Miss Marple had already suspected, that Sir Alister had been poisoned before being positioned in the motor car to simulate suicide. "She was so careful about it, miss," Elsie confided, her voice barely above a whisper, moving his arms and legs just so, buttoning his waistcoat with such particular attention. But Sir wasn't helping none, just lying there while she arranged him like he was already gone. The pajamas and dressing gown that Lady Caroline had ordered burned contained traces of the same concentrated digitalis solution that had killed Mrs. Wade, providing scientific confirmation of the murder method. Dr. Haydock's subsequent examination revealed that Sir Alister had been rendered unconscious through a mild dose in his evening cocoa, then killed through topical application of the concentrated poison while helpless to resist. Miss Marple's systematic pressure campaign. Rather than confront Lady Caroline directly with accusations that could be denied or deflected, Miss Marple embarked upon a subtle campaign of psychological pressure designed to exploit her adversary's growing desperation. Each seemingly innocent encounter was carefully calculated to demonstrate the inexorable closing of investigative nets, while maintaining the gentle facade that had made Miss Marple's reputation as St. Mary Mead's most perceptive observer of human nature. Her condolence visit to Ashworth Manor included carefully placed observations about the muniment room fire and the curious survival of certain evidence. "Such a remarkable pen," she mused while examining the fire damage, "with that distinctive blue-green ink. I remember seeing Lady Caroline use one exactly like it." The subtle implication that Miss Marple had noticed the forged confession's true authorship created the first crack in Lady Caroline's composed facade. The conversation with Mr. Henderson, the head gardener, served multiple purposes, confirming Lady Caroline's access to the rare white foxgloves, while simultaneously ensuring that news of Miss Marple's interest would reach Lady Caroline through the efficient village gossip network. The psychological effect of knowing that her botanical activities were under scrutiny began to tell in Lady Caroline's increasingly nervous behavior and her obsessive attention to the herb garden's appearance. The vicarage tea service. Trap. The final psychological test required a setting that would provide both intimacy and symbolic resonance, and Miss Marple chose the vicarage sitting room for what she described as a small meeting to discuss the memorial fund's future. The neutral ground would soothe suspicions while providing the perfect stage for the delicate confrontation that would expose Lady Caroline's guilt through her own reactions rather than external accusation. The gathering assembled with studied casualness. Mrs. Bantry with her characteristic warmth, Mrs. Price Ridley determined to be helpful in ways that would satisfy her curiosity, the Reverend Ponsonby anxious to avoid unpleasantness, and Lady Caroline maintaining her facade of grieving widowhood despite the brittle quality that had begun to characterize her composure since Sir Alister's death. Miss Marple's observation of the tea service preparations provided the crucial moment of revelation. When Lady Caroline personally arranged the sugar bowl, the same ornate piece that had delivered death at the memorial service, Miss Marple noted the unconscious precision with which she selected and placed the cubes, demonstrating the practiced familiarity that could only come from having prepared similar arrangements before. The sugar bowl's symbolic return. The reappearance of the silver sugar bowl carried profound symbolic weight that Miss Marple exploited with characteristic subtlety. Her gentle reminiscence about Mrs. Wade's pride in avoiding sugar created the perfect opportunity to observe Lady Caroline's reactions while establishing the psychological framework for the final revelation. "Such a comfort, tea," Miss Marple observed mildly, watching Lady Caroline's hands as she prepared the service. "I always think the way a person pours tells one everything important. When people are distressed, too much or too little sugar can be so very revealing." When Lady Caroline offered to add sugar to Miss Marple's cup, the elderly detective noted the telltale scratches on the selected cube, microscopic marks that matched Dr. Haydock's description of the poisoned sugar from the memorial service. The realization that she was witnessing another attempted murder filled Miss Marple with the cold certainty that had guided her through decades of observing human nature at its most dangerous. The botanical knowledge revealed. The conversation's drift toward botanical matters provided Miss Marple with the opportunity to demonstrate her awareness of Lady Caroline's specialized knowledge, while allowing the guilty party to reveal herself through her own expertise. The discussion of foxglove preparation techniques, ostensibly casual reminiscence about old-fashioned remedies, became a subtle interrogation that exposed Lady Caroline's sophisticated understanding of digitalis extraction and concentration. "My grandmother had a receipt," Lady Caroline explained with unconscious pride. "One must macerate at low temperature and measure by weight, not volume." The technical precision of her response, combined with her obvious familiarity with advanced preparation methods, provided confirmation of her ability to create the concentrated poison that had killed both Mrs. Wade and Sir Alister. Marcus Bell's strategic intervention. The carefully timed arrival of Marcus Bell with Lady Vivian's recovered will created the crisis that Miss Marple had been orchestrating throughout the psychological campaign. The document's existence threatened to expose not only Lady Caroline's systematic embezzlement, but also the elaborate web of deception that had necessitated multiple murders to maintain. Lady Caroline's reaction to the will's contents, her sudden pallor, the tremor in her hands, and her desperate attempt to avoid reading the trustee designation aloud, provided the final confirmation of her guilt. The realization that Mrs. Wade had been named primary trustee of Lady Vivian's charitable bequests explained both the motive for her murder and the systematic theft that had preceded it. The gentle revelation. Miss Marple's final observations combined all the accumulated evidence into an inexorable chain of reasoning that exposed Lady Caroline's crimes without requiring dramatic accusation or confrontation. Her gentle comments about people betraying what they fear, the significance of offering comfort at precisely the wrong moment, and the persistent nature of putty stains on gloves created a web of implication that Lady Caroline could neither deny nor escape. "It is odd how people betray what they fear," Miss Marple remarked with characteristic mildness. "One says the wrong thing, offers the wrong comfort, leaves the wrong traces behind." Her voice carried the gentle authority that had made her reputation as someone who saw through the careful facades that people constructed to hide their darkest secrets. Inspector Slack's emergence from the shadowed doorway provided the official conclusion to Miss Marple's psychological investigation, though the real revelation had occurred in the subtle interplay of observation and reaction that characterized her approach to exposing human evil. Lady Caroline's final comment about lace and lavender carried both bitterness and grudging admiration for the gentle persistence that had unraveled her elaborate deception. The complete pattern exposed. The psychological test had succeeded in demonstrating Lady Caroline's guilt through her own reactions rather than external evidence, though the physical proof, the botanical knowledge, the forged confession, the systematic embezzlement, and the attempted poisoning provided ample support for the charges that would follow. Miss Marple had orchestrated the revelation with a patient precision that characterized her approach to human nature, allowing the guilty party to expose herself through the very qualities that had made her crimes possible. The memorial service for a woman who wasn't dead had become a funeral for multiple victims, and the final act had revealed that the most dangerous evil often wore the most respectable face. Lady Caroline's willingness to murder her own husband to protect her secrets demonstrated a capacity for calculated cruelty that shocked even those accustomed to human weakness, and her systematic betrayal of community trust represented a corruption that extended far beyond simple theft into the darkest regions of human moral failure. Miss Marple's gentle but inexorable investigation had exposed the truth through the accumulated weight of small observations and psychological insights, proving once again that the most effective revelations often came not through dramatic confrontation, but through the patient application of understanding human nature at its most revealing and most deadly. The vicarage drawing-room had acquired that peculiar quality of suspended time that follows any moment when long-hidden truths prepare to emerge into daylight. Miss Marple sat with her knitting resting quietly in her lap, her mild blue eyes observing the assembled company with the patient attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read the subtle language of human behavior under pressure. The arrival of Marcus Bell with Lady Vivian's recovered will had created the perfect catalyst for the final revelation, though Miss Marple had already perceived that the most crucial work would be accomplished not through dramatic accusation, but through the gentle application of understanding human nature at its most vulnerable. The gentle unveiling. "It is curious," Miss Marple began in her characteristically mild tone, "how often people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are being most careful. Lady Caroline, you have been extraordinarily careful and extraordinarily revealing. Lady Caroline maintained her composed posture in the chair beside the tea service, though Miss Marple noted the telltale tremor in her hands as she reached for her cup. The elegant silver sugar bowl sat between them like a silent witness, its ornate surface reflecting the lamplight with the same deceptive beauty that had masked its deadly purpose at the memorial service. The memorial fete was beautifully organized, Miss Marple continued, her needles resuming their gentle rhythm. Every detail considered, every arrangement perfect, including the sugar cubes, so carefully prepared with their tiny scratches. Invisible to anyone who didn't know to look for them, but quite unmistakable to someone who had made them herself. Inspector Slack stepped forward from his position near the window, his notebook ready, though his attention was focused entirely on Miss Marple's quiet exposition. The official investigation had provided the physical evidence, but everyone present understood that the real detection had occurred through observation and deduction rather than forensic analysis. The complete pattern revealed. Mrs. Wade's death appeared to result from shock at Lady Vivian's unexpected return, Miss Marple observed, glancing toward Lady Vivian, who sat pale but composed near the fireplace. But the digitalis in her system told a different story entirely. Someone had offered her comfort in her moment of distress. "Here, dear, this will steady you." And she had accepted what seemed like motherly kindness, but was actually a precisely calculated death sentence. Timothy Wade leaned forward in his chair, his young face tight with controlled emotion as Miss Marple continued her gentle but inexorable revelation. The financial records spread across the side table provided documentary evidence of the systematic embezzlement that had necessitated his aunt's murder. But the human story behind the crime was emerging through Miss Marple's patient reconstruction of motive and method. The charitable funds had been systematically diverted over 18 months, Miss Marple explained, her voice carrying the same tone she might use to discuss a particularly challenging knitting pattern. Small amounts, never enough to be immediately noticed, but accumulating to substantial sums. Lady Caroline, your gambling debts had grown beyond any possibility of concealment, and Lady Vivian's new will threatened to expose the theft while simultaneously eliminating the inheritance that might have provided salvation. Lady Caroline's facade of composed grief finally began to crack, revealing beneath it the desperate calculation of someone who had murdered multiple victims to protect her carefully constructed deception. Her botanical knowledge, gained through scholarly study at Girton, had provided the means to prepare concentrated digitalis from the rare white foxgloves in the Ashworth herb garden. Her position as treasurer of multiple charitable organizations had provided both opportunity and cover for the systematic theft that had funded her addiction to speculation. The husband's murder. Exposed. Sir Alister's supposed suicide was your most sophisticated deception, Miss Marple continued, her gentle voice carrying an authority that made denial impossible. The confession was carefully forged, though your distinctive blue-green ink betrayed its true authorship when examined closely. Poor Alister was rendered unconscious through digitalis in his evening cocoa, then killed through topical application of the concentrated poison before being positioned in the motor car to simulate carbon monoxide poisoning. Marcus Bell produced the blotting paper that bore the reversed impressions of Lady Caroline's practice attempts at her husband's signature, while Dr. Haydock's medical evidence confirmed the true cause of death. The muniment room fire had been Lady Caroline's desperate attempt to destroy evidence of her financial crimes, though the incomplete success had left enough documentation to expose the full scope of her systematic betrayal of community trust. "You dressed him with such care," Miss Marple observed with genuine sadness. "Elsie saw you arranging his clothing like a doll, positioning him with the meticulous attention to detail that had characterized all your crimes. Even in murder, you could not help but tidy as you went." Lady Caroline's dignified defeat. Lady Caroline set down her teacup with deliberate precision, her movements carrying the controlled grace of someone who had accepted inevitable consequences. When she spoke, her voice retained its cultured tones despite the circumstances, displaying the same composure that had made her crimes possible through its ability to inspire trust and deflect suspicion. "You are quite correct, Miss Marple," she said with unexpected calm. "The memorial service provided the perfect opportunity to eliminate Mrs. Wade while dealing with Vivian's inconvenient resurrection. The digitalis was prepared from our own foxgloves. The white variety requires more careful extraction, but produces a more concentrated solution." Her confession revealed the true sophistication of her criminal enterprise, extending far beyond simple theft into systematic manipulation of charitable funds, forged documents, and calculated murder. The gambling addiction had begun as sophisticated entertainment among London society, but had progressed into desperate speculation that required increasingly criminal measures to sustain. Emmeline had become dangerously close to exposing the missing funds, Lady Caroline continued with clinical detachment. Her investigation threatened not only financial ruin, but social disgrace that would have destroyed everything I'd worked to build. The memorial service offered what seemed like the perfect solution. Her death would appear natural while eliminating the threat she represented. The attempted final murder, Miss Marple's gentle observation about the reappearance of the silver sugar bowl at their recent luncheon, created the moment of final revelation that exposed Lady Caroline's willingness to continue killing to protect her secrets. The marked sugar cubes prepared for Timothy Wade had been identical to those that had killed his aunt, demonstrating a pattern of behavior that spoke of calculated malice disguised as charitable hospitality. The psychological pressure of knowing that your crimes were being investigated had driven you to increasingly desperate measures, Miss Marple observed with characteristic understanding of human weakness under stress. Timothy's continuation of his aunt's financial investigation posed the same threat that had necessitated her murder, and you prepared the same solution using the identical method. Inspector Slack's formal arrest proceeded with the methodical efficiency that characterized official procedure, though the real detection had been accomplished through Miss Marple's patient observation and gentle psychological pressure. Lady Caroline's systematic betrayal of community trust represented a form of corruption that extended far beyond simple theft into the deliberate destruction of social bonds that held village life together. Village resolution and reflection. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the community began the slow process of absorbing revelations that would reshape their understanding of respectability and moral character. The systematic theft from charitable funds, the calculated murder of respected community members, and the cold-blooded elimination of her own husband challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between social position and moral worth. Lady Vivian's return from supposed death had triggered a chain of revelations that exposed financial crimes, personal betrayals, and multiple murders, all orchestrated by someone whose position of trust had made her crimes possible while simultaneously providing perfect cover for their execution. The memorial service, intended to honor the dead, had instead become the catalyst for exposing systematic corruption that had poisoned the heart of village life. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and prepared to return to her cottage, reflecting upon the case that had demonstrated how easily respectability could mask the darkest intentions. The gentle facade of village charitable work had concealed systematic betrayal, maternal comfort had delivered death, and the most sacred bonds of marriage and community trust had been weaponized in service of greed and desperation. Final wisdom. "It is a dreadful thing," Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Bantry as they walked together down the lane, "how kindness can be made to serve cruelty. One learns over time that wickedness often looks like care when it is frightened. It arranges flowers with great attention, pours tea with elaborate precision, and speaks of others' faults to spare embarrassment." The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to reveal secrets that someone was willing to kill repeatedly to protect. But it was the living who had proven most dangerous. In the quiet drawing rooms and charitable gatherings of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had once again demonstrated that the most effective revelations came through patient observation rather than dramatic confrontation, and that understanding human nature remained the most reliable guide to exposing evil in all its carefully disguised forms. As she settled into her favorite chair with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected that the great dramas of murder and deception would pass, but the small rhythms of village life would continue. It was there, in those gentle routines of tea and conversation, that both evil and goodness revealed themselves most clearly to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to understand what they observed. The memorial for the dead had become a reckoning for the living, and St. Mary Mead would heal, as it always did, through the quiet application of justice tempered with understanding of human frailty and the endless capacity for both corruption and redemption that dwelt within every human heart. The weeks following Lady Caroline Ashworth's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar quality of exhausted relief that settles over communities after the resolution of terrible events. The village moved through the delicate rituals by which small places mend themselves after scandal. Quiet conversations over garden gates, carefully worded condolences, and the gradual restoration of routines that had been shattered by revelation and death. Legal resolution and community reckoning. Lady Caroline's trial at Much Benham became the subject of intense, albeit discreet, local fascination. The evidence presented by Inspector Slack, reinforced by Marcus Bell's financial expertise and Dr. Haydock's scientific testimony, created an unassailable case. Timothy Wade's account of his aunt's meticulous investigation, Lady Vivian's testimony about the forged will, and most compellingly, Miss Marple's gentle but devastating reconstruction of the psychological manipulation that had made the murders possible, left the jury with no room for reasonable doubt. The financial audit revealed the true scope of Lady Caroline's criminal enterprise. Nearly £800 systematically diverted from charitable collections over 18 months, using her position of trust to redirect funds intended for church repairs, orphan support, and community improvement projects. Her botanical knowledge, gained through legitimate scholarly study at Girton, had been weaponized to create the concentrated digitalis that killed both Mrs. Wade and Sir Alistair. The forged suicide note, written in distinctive blue-green ink that betrayed its true authorship, demonstrated her willingness to sacrifice even her husband to protect her elaborate deception. When the verdict of guilty was delivered with appropriate solemnity, it confirmed what the village had struggled to accept, that evil could indeed flourish behind the most respectable facades, and that trust, once systematically betrayed, left scars that would require years to heal. The manor's uncertain future. Sir Alistair's funeral was conducted quietly and privately at Lady Vivian's insistence, attended by those whose loyalty had never depended on money or position. Mrs. Greaves, white-faced but resolute, the head gardener with his cap respectfully in his weathered hands, and the Reverend Ponsonby, whose voice faltered only once, not from uncertainty but from genuine compassion. It was generally agreed, though never spoken aloud, that Sir Alistair had been more weak than wicked, and that his legacy would be pity rather than censure. Lady Vivian's decision about resuming residence at Ashworth Manor required considerable deliberation. The building held too many memories of her nephew's weakness and his wife's calculated evil, and she initially considered establishing herself in a smaller property in Much Benham. However, after weeks of careful thought and consultation with the remaining staff, she chose to return to the manor, not as a retreat into past grandeur, but as a deliberate act of reclamation and renewal. Families should remember the truth about themselves, she explained to Miss Marple during one of their afternoon walks. Even when it is uncomfortable, the manor has seen both goodness and evil under its roof. Running away would dishonor those who suffered there. Memorial and institutional reform. The genuine memorial service for Mrs. Wade, held 3 weeks after Lady Caroline's arrest, provided the community with an opportunity to process both grief and guilt about having initially accepted her death as natural shock. The service was conducted with the dignity her decades of charitable work deserved, though Miss Marple noticed how carefully the refreshments were served from borrowed china, avoiding any piece that might evoke memories of the silver sugar bowl that had delivered death disguised as comfort. Lady Vivian's first official act upon resuming control of her estate was establishing the Emmeline Wade Charitable Foundation, ensuring that the funds so diligently protected by Mrs. Wade would serve their intended purpose while implementing new oversight procedures to prevent future embezzlement. Timothy Wade, despite his youth and inexperience, accepted the position of primary administrator with the passionate commitment to transparency that his aunt's murder had inspired. The charitable organizations throughout the village implemented new financial controls, dual signatures for all expenditures, rotating audit responsibilities, and regular independent reviews. These changes, while necessary, served as constant reminders of how thoroughly Lady Caroline had exploited the community's fundamental assumption that respectability guaranteed trustworthiness. The village's changed perspective. Mrs. Price Ridley, whose authoritative pronouncements had shifted from speculation to vindication during the investigation, now spoke more quietly about the hidden depths that could exist within human nature. Her usual certainty was tempered by the unsettling awareness that her complete failure to detect Lady Caroline's corruption challenged her confidence in reading character. "One simply cannot know people," she confided to Miss Marple with uncharacteristic humility. Mrs. Bantry expressed the community's collective sadness more directly. "It is almost worst when cruelty comes with such perfect manners," she observed during one of their regular walks along the hedge where blackberries ripen later than expected. The village's innocence, that comfortable assumption that evil announced itself through obvious signs, had been irrevocably altered by the knowledge that calculated murder could be delivered through maternal comfort and charitable service. The physical reminders. The herb garden at Ashworth Manor underwent complete transformation under the head gardener's quietly angry attention. The white foxgloves, so carefully cultivated for their rare beauty and deadly potential, were uprooted entirely and replaced with lavender, a deliberate choice that spoke of healing rather than harm. "Best not to keep reminders," he told Mrs. Greaves, though they both understood that some memories could never be entirely erased. Lady Vivian made an unusual decision about the silver sugar bowl that had served as the murder weapon. Rather than destroying it or hiding it away, she chose to preserve it in a locked display case in the muniment room, accompanied by a card noting precisely why it was there. "Families should remember the truth about themselves," she explained to Miss Marple, "even when it is uncomfortable. Future generations should understand how easily beauty can serve evil when wielded by those who understand the forms of kindness without possessing its substance." Miss Marple's quiet wisdom. Marcus Bell's farewell visit to Miss Marple carried professional admiration for her psychological approach to detection. "If you ever wanted employment," he suggested with genuine respect, "I dare say we could find you quite a number of clients in London." "My dear Mr. Bell," Miss Marple replied with gentle amusement, "I have quite enough clients in St. Mary Mead, though they don't always know it. They pay me in anecdotes and in the rare luxury of being useful when it truly matters." Her reflection on the case encompassed broader questions about the nature of evil and the ways social respectability could mask the darkest intentions. "The most dangerous criminals," she observed to Dr. Haydock during one of their regular conversations, "are often those who understand goodness well enough to counterfeit it perfectly." Lady Caroline's charitable work wasn't mere camouflage. She genuinely comprehended the importance of community support and used that knowledge to exploit the very people she was supposed to serve. The return to quiet rhythms. As autumn deepened into winter, St. Mary Mead began its slow process of healing. The Reverend Ponsonby preached a sermon that surprised those expecting thunder, speaking not of sin in abstract terms, but of kindness in practice, of how true consolation attends to the person rather than the appearance, and how the community must learn the modest art of bringing genuine comfort rather than mere display. The daily routines gradually resumed their familiar patterns, though with deeper undercurrents of awareness. Children continued to play on the village green, church bells still chimed for Sunday service, but the community carried new understanding about the complexities of human morality. The surface calm of St. Mary Mead now held recognition of the currents that ran beneath. The hidden resentments, buried scandals, and personal betrayals that, when disturbed, could erupt with devastating force. Final reflection. Miss Marple, settling into her evening routine of knitting and contemplation, felt the quiet satisfaction that came from seeing justice accomplished through patient observation rather than dramatic confrontation. The case had demonstrated once again that understanding human nature remained the most reliable guide to exposing evil in all its carefully disguised forms. It is curious how people reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they are being most careful, she mused to herself, watching the steady rhythm of her needles in the lamplight. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to expose secrets that someone was willing to kill repeatedly to protect, but it had been the living who proved most dangerous. The memorial for the dead had become a reckoning for the living, and St. Mary Mead would remember the lessons learned through tragedy while working to prevent their repetition. Evil might disguise itself as virtue, maternal comfort might deliver death, and the most sacred bonds of community trust could be weaponized by those who understood their power. But patient observation and gentle persistence would always eventually expose the truth, no matter how carefully it had been concealed beneath charitable work and social respectability. As Miss Marple took up her knitting once more, she reflected that the great dramas of murder and deception would pass, but the small rhythms of village life would continue. It was there, in those gentle routines of tea and conversation, that both evil and goodness revealed themselves most clearly to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to understand what they observed. The pattern of people in a small place remained endlessly interesting, and one must always keep the stitches even, darning where needed, and cutting away frayed threads where kindness had been used to tie knots about the neck. St. Mary Mead had shuddered, set its teacup straight, and would go on. Wiser now, more watchful, but fundamentally unchanged in its capacity for both human weakness and the quiet heroism that eventually exposes and defeats it. Snow came early to St. Mary Mead that year, settling over the village like a gentle benediction that softened harsh edges and muffled the echoes of recent tragedy. The white mantle transformed familiar landmarks into something approaching fairy tale beauty, though Miss Marple, observing from her cottage window as she arranged seed catalogues beside her knitting, reflected that the village had learned too much about human nature to believe entirely in fairy tales anymore. The season of healing. The Christmas season brought a quality of determined festivity that spoke more of healing than mere celebration. Lady Caroline Ashworth's conviction at Much Benham had provided official closure, but the deeper work of community recovery required the sort of patient attention that Miss Marple had observed villagers apply to their wounds over many decades. People walked more carefully on the high street, spoke in slightly lowered voices, and chose their words with the consideration that comes after discovering how thoroughly trust can be betrayed by those who understand its forms most perfectly. Mrs. Greaves at the manor had lost her habit of apologizing for things beyond her control, offering plain tea with a steadiness that Miss Marple found admirable. The housekeeper's transformation from anxious servitude to quiet dignity illustrated the curious ways in which terrible events sometimes revealed strength that had always existed but never been tested. The Memorial Garden's completion. Lady Vivian's decision to complete the Memorial Garden, originally planned for the summer fete, provided both practical occupation and symbolic healing for the entire community. The project, funded entirely from her personal resources, rather than charitable collections, transformed the space near the church where Mrs. Wade had died into something genuinely beautiful, rather than merely commemorative. Timothy Wade worked alongside the professional gardeners with passionate dedication, his transformation from nervous grief to purposeful action, demonstrating how tragedy could sometimes forge unexpected strength. His establishment of office hours for the Emmeline Wade Charitable Foundation in a drafty room behind the post office spoke of determination to honor his aunt's memory through constructive service rather than continued investigation. Aunt Emmeline would have approved, he confided to Miss Marple during one of her afternoon walks past the construction site. She always said proper memorials should serve the living rather than simply honoring the dead. The children will have somewhere safe to play, and the elderly will have benches positioned to catch the morning sun. The garden's design deliberately avoided any reference to the circumstances of Mrs. Wade's death, focusing instead on the decades of charitable work that had defined her life. A small plaque near the entrance bore only her name, dates, and the simple inscription, "She served her community with devotion and integrity." The understatement was intentional, allowing those who remembered the full story to appreciate its significance while not burdening future generations with details they need not carry. Lady Vivian's measured return. Lady Vivian resumed her place at Ashworth Manor with a dignity that confounded those who had expected either melodrama or retreat. She went about the restoration without flourishing her bravery, choosing rooms, consulting the head gardener, and sending for certain household staff who had shown resource during difficult times. The manor itself had been thoroughly renovated, with particular attention to the muniment room and herb garden, creating spaces that could be occupied without constant reminders of recent horrors. Her first official entertainment was a small tea party for the ladies who had maintained charitable organizations during her supposed death, a gesture that acknowledged their service while establishing her intention to resume active participation in community life. Miss Marple, observing the careful choreography of renewed social relations, noted how skillfully Lady Vivian managed the transition from grateful appreciation to gentle authority. "Houses know more than people suppose," Lady Vivian remarked during their Thursday tea in the smaller drawing room, where afternoon light fell exactly as she preferred across the blue draperies. "They don't judge, they remember. I should like my family to remember too. It prevents a great deal of nonsense." Her glance toward the cabinet containing the preserved silver sugar bowl carried deeper meaning about stewardship and the importance of acknowledging uncomfortable truths rather than hiding them away. The village's evolved understanding. Mrs. Price Ridley's Christmas observations to the assembled ladies at the post office demonstrated how profoundly the community's understanding of human nature had been altered by recent events. Her usual certainty about character assessment had been replaced by more nuanced appreciation of the complexities that could exist beneath respectable facades. "One learns that wickedness often presents itself through the forms of virtue," she observed with uncharacteristic humility. Lady Caroline's charitable work was genuine in its effects, even when her motives were corrupt. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between those who serve others from love and those who serve from calculation. The conversation revealed how the village had begun developing new ways of thinking about trust and verification. Charitable organizations now employed multiple oversight procedures, but more significantly, the community had learned to ask different questions about motivation and observe behavior patterns rather than simply accepting surface presentations. Professional reflections. Marcus Bell's farewell visit carried professional admiration for Miss Marple's psychological approach to detection. "In the city," he said, adjusting his brown scarf with London cheer, "our cases run on telephones and bank ledgers. Here, you solve them with cups and saucers." Miss Marple's smile had navigated dangerous corners for many years and was none the worse for wear. One sees so much with cups and saucers, Mr. Bell. People pour themselves out when they pour for others. Dr. Haydock's final consultation provided medical perspective on the sophisticated nature of Lady Caroline's crimes. Her botanical knowledge had enabled preparation of digitalis concentrations that would mimic natural heart failure while ensuring rapid death, demonstrating scientific understanding that made her crimes particularly dangerous. The most disturbing aspect was her willingness to exploit medical knowledge for destructive purposes, he reflected. This wasn't passionate crime, but cold, scientific application of lethal knowledge. Inspector Slack called one afternoon to return a book he hadn't borrowed, standing on the mat with the air of someone who had reached a position from which he wouldn't retreat. "I dare say you'll think me a fool for taking that confession at face value." "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple protested gently, "fools do not bring blotting paper." It was both kindness and truth, acknowledging his thorough investigation while recognizing the psychological sophistication that had made Lady Caroline's deception so effective. Financial and institutional recovery. The Emmeline Wade Charitable Foundation's first reports in January were models of clarity and accountability. A new stove for the school kitchen, repairs to the almshouse's windows, a small grant for a promising girl's apprenticeship in Much Benham. Miss Marple read the pamphlet by her fire and thought of Emmeline Wade, brisk, managing, a little vain about her self-discipline, and exceptionally good at getting things done. It was the best kind of memorial to work that went on quietly behind the loud parts of life. The recovery of stolen funds had proven partially successful, though Lady Caroline's gambling losses had consumed substantial portions of the embezzled money. Timothy's implementation of robust oversight systems made future embezzlement virtually impossible while preserving the spontaneous generosity that made charitable work effective. Miss Marple's final wisdom. As winter deepened and the fire crackled cheerfully in her sitting room, Miss Marple reflected upon the intricate tapestry of events that had unfolded. The case had reinforced her understanding of human nature, while adding new dimensions to her appreciation of how evil could disguise itself within social respectability. The most chilling aspect, she had confided to Mrs. Bantry during one of their regular walks, was Lady Caroline's ability to provide genuine comfort while simultaneously administering death. She understood maternal care well enough to counterfeit it perfectly, using that knowledge to exploit the most basic human need for consolation during distress. The psychological sophistication of the crimes had required someone who understood human behavior at its most vulnerable points. Lady Caroline had exploited Mrs. Wade's pride in avoiding sugar, Sir Alister's trust in his wife's care, and the entire community's assumption that charitable work indicated charitable motivation. "It is always human nature," Miss Marple mused aloud one evening, her needles clicking softly, not the grand, dramatic gestures that people imagine, but the small, persistent patterns. Lady Caroline's gambling, her fear of exposure, her desperate need to maintain appearances. These were the true poisons, far more insidious than the digitalis she administered. Seasonal restoration and hope. The Christmas Eve service carried particular poignancy as the community gathered to celebrate renewal after a year marked by revelation and loss. The Reverend Ponsonby's sermon focused on light emerging from darkness, though his words carried deeper meaning for those who had witnessed how thoroughly evil could disguise itself within apparent goodness. Children's voices rose in innocent song, reminding everyone of what they were working to protect, while adults listened with deeper appreciation that came from understanding how fragile such innocence could be. The village had learned painful lessons about human complexity, but had also demonstrated the resilience that came from facing truth honestly rather than retreating into comfortable illusions. Final reflection. On a day when light held that washed, pewter quality that comes before snow decides to fall again, Miss Marple walked home by the long route past the pond. Children tested the ice edges with sticks, while sensible mothers called them back. A woman carrying bread stopped to inquire after Mary's rheumatism. A boy offered to carry Miss Marple's basket and forgot to ask for payment. It was all very ordinary, the sort of ordinary that takes the place of courage once courage has done its work. At her gate, she paused to adjust the small woolen scarf she had knitted for her neighbour's cat, who sat impressed with itself and watched sparrows with dignity any magistrate might envy. Inside, she arranged cups and laid out plates while the kettle came to boil, untying a small parcel from Lady Vivian. Ceylon tea and a note reading simply, "For the right hands." Miss Marple sat down and let steam bloom from her cup, warming the window pane and blurring the world into friendly shapes. Murder, she reflected, did not teach new things about human nature so much as confirm what one already knew, that people were infinitely transparent if one were patient, and infinitely mysterious if one were not. Wickedness wore lace and lavender as readily as it wore a scowl, and goodness, when it came, was nearly always quiet and sometimes a little awkward. Outside, the first flakes recommenced their slow, deliberate descent. St. Mary Mead received them as it received everything else, with small remarks, practical measures, and the resilient politeness that had seen it through wars, scandals, and the peculiarities of the human heart. The village would continue, a little wiser, more watchful, but fundamentally unchanged in its capacity for both human weakness and the quiet heroism that eventually exposed and defeated evil in all its carefully disguised forms. Miss Marple poured out her tea, added nothing at all, and was content. The pattern of life continued, and she would continue to watch and understand, knowing that both goodness and evil revealed themselves most clearly to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to act when action became necessary. The lady who was supposed to be dead had returned to expose secrets that someone was willing to kill repeatedly to protect, but the living had ultimately proven stronger than the forces that sought to destroy them. In the gentle rhythms of village life, the pouring of tea, the knitting of patterns, the quiet observation of human nature, Miss Marple had once again demonstrated that justice could be accomplished through patience, understanding, and the inexorable application of truth to the darkest corners of the human heart.